Dean Martin was performing live on television when someone in the studio audience stood up and shouted a death threat at him. What Dean did next didn't just diffuse the situation, it became the coolest, most legendary response in entertainment history. It was November 18, 1965, and Dean Martin was halfway through his signature song That's Amore during a live broadcast of The Dean Martin Show when the unthinkable happened. The NBC studio was packed with 300 excited audience members, and 40 million viewers across America were watching from their living rooms when a man in the third row suddenly stood up and screamed something that made the entire studio fall silent. "Dean Martin, you're a dead man!" The words cut through the music like a knife, and for a split second, everything stopped. The orchestra fumbled to a halt, the audience gasped in shock, and the television cameras captured the moment when a death threat was delivered on live national television. But what happened next would become the stuff of legend, not just in television history, but in the annals of how to handle pressure with unshakable cool. The man making the threat was Vince Torino, a 35-year-old construction worker from Brooklyn who had somehow gotten tickets to the show's taping. Vince was standing in the audience pointing directly at Dean with a look of pure rage on his face. "You think you're so cool, so untouchable," Vince shouted, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent studio. "Well, I've got news for you, pretty boy. You won't make it out of this studio alive." The studio audience was frozen in terror. Many people started looking toward the exits, wondering if they should run. The NBC security guards began moving toward Vince, but they were several rows away, and the studio was packed too tightly for them to reach him quickly. In the control room, producer Greg Garrison was frantically trying to figure out what to do. They were broadcasting live to 40 million people, and cutting away would create even more chaos and potentially give the impression that Dean Martin was in serious danger. "Should we cut to commercial?" the director asked frantically. "No," said Garrison, watching Dean on the monitors. "Let's see how he handles this." What Dean Martin did next has been studied by crisis management experts, television historians, and anyone interested in how to maintain composure under the most extreme pressure. Dean didn't run. He didn't call for security. He didn't show even a flicker of fear. Instead, Dean Martin smiled. Not just any smile, the same easy, charming smile he wore when he was chatting with friends at a party. He looked at Vince Torino as if the man had just told a mildly amusing joke rather than threatened to kill him on national television. Then Dean did something that no one saw coming. He walked toward Vince. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the same casual, confident stride he used when walking to the microphone. As if walking toward a man who had just threatened to kill him was the most natural thing in the world. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Dean Martin approached the man who wanted him dead. The cameras followed his every move, broadcasting this incredible display of courage to millions of viewers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. When Dean got close enough to Vince to speak without shouting, he stopped and spoke in his normal, conversational voice, which was somehow picked up clearly by the studio microphones. "You know, pal," Dean said with that famous Martin charm, "I was just thinking this show needed a little more excitement. Thank you for volunteering to be part of the act." The response was so unexpected, so perfectly delivered, that several people in the audience actually started to laugh despite the terrifying situation. But Dean wasn't finished.
"Tell me something, friend," Dean continued, still smiling that easy smile. "Are you here with anyone tonight? Wife, girlfriend, kids?" Vince looked confused by the question. He had expected Dean to either run away or fight back, not engage him in casual conversation. My wife is here," Vince stammered, some of the rage leaving his voice. "Well, that's wonderful," Dean replied. "Where is she sitting? I'd like to say hello." Dean's response was so disarmingly friendly that Vince actually pointed to a woman in the second row who was covering her face with her hands in embarrassment. "Ma'am," Dean called out to Vince's wife, "your husband here seems to think I need some excitement in my life. What do you think? Do I look like I need more excitement?" The woman, mortified by her husband's behavior, but somehow charmed by Dean's response, managed to shake her head. "That's what I thought," Dean said with a grin. "You know, Vince, can I call you Vince? Your wife seems like a smart lady. Maybe you should listen to her more often." By this point, Vince was completely confused. He had come to the show planning to disrupt it, possibly to hurt Dean Martin, but instead he found himself having a conversation with the man he had threatened, and that man was treating him like an old friend who had just said something silly. Dean continued his masterful diffusion of the situation. "Here's what I'm thinking, Vince," Dean said, putting his hand on the man's shoulder in a gesture that was both friendly and confident. "You paid good money for these tickets, your wife got all dressed up for a night out, and I've got a show to finish. So how about we make a deal?" Vince nodded weakly, all of his aggressive energy now completely deflated. "You sit back down, enjoy the rest of the show, and after we're done, I'll personally introduce you to Frank Sinatra, who's backstage right now. How does that sound?" The offer was so generous, so unexpected, that Vince could only nod in agreement. "But there's one condition," Dean added with a theatrical wink to the audience. "No more death threats during the love songs. It ruins the mood." The entire studio erupted in laughter and applause. What had begun as a terrifying situation had been transformed into entertainment by Dean Martin's unshakable composure and quick wit. Dean walked back to the microphone, gestured to the orchestra conductor, and said, "Well, now that we've got that settled, how about we pick up where we left off?" The band resumed playing That's Amore, and Dean finished the song as if nothing had happened. But something magical occurred during the rest of the performance. The audience, which had been tense and frightened, was now completely captivated by what they had witnessed. They had just seen a masterclass in how to handle crisis with grace, humor, and absolute fearlessness. What made Dean's response even more remarkable was what happened in the control room during those crucial 5 minutes. Producer Greg Garrison later revealed that NBC executives were on the phone demanding they cut away from the broadcast immediately. "They were screaming at me to go to commercial," Garrison recalled years later, "but I kept watching Dean on the monitors and I could see he had the situation completely under control. I made the decision to let it play out, and it became the greatest live television moment I ever produced." The network switchboard lit up within minutes of the incident, but instead of complaints about violence or inappropriate content, NBC received thousands of calls from viewers praising Dean's handling of the situation. Many callers asked when the clip would be rebroadcast. After the show, Dean kept his promise. He brought Vince and his wife backstage to meet Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and the rest of the Rat Pack. The man who had threatened to kill him an hour earlier was now getting autographs and taking pictures with some of the biggest stars in entertainment. But the backstage encounter revealed even more about Dean's character. Instead of treating Vince like a curiosity or a dangerous person who needed to be managed, Dean spent genuine time talking with him about his life, his frustrations, and his problems. "Dean asked me about my job, my family, my dreams," Vince later recalled. "He treated me like I was worth listening to, even after I had threatened to kill him on national television. That kind of genuine interest in another person, that's not something you can fake." Frank Sinatra, who witnessed the backstage interaction, was amazed by Dean's continued kindness toward someone who had threatened his life. "I would have had the guy arrested," Frank admitted, "but Dean saw something in him that needed healing, not punishment. That's when I realized Dean wasn't just a great entertainer, he was a great human being."
Vince Turino later told reporters that meeting Dean Martin backstage had been one of the most profound experiences of his life. "I went to that show angry about everything," Vince explained. I was angry about my job, angry about my life, angry about people who seemed to have everything I didn't. But when Dean treated me with kindness instead of fear or anger, it made me realize that the problem wasn't with him, it was with me. Vince said that Dean's response to his threat had taught him more about how to handle conflict than anything else in his life. He could have had me arrested. He could have humiliated me in front of my wife and 40 million people. Instead, he showed me what real strength looks like. It's not about fighting. It's about staying calm and treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it. The television industry was equally amazed by what they had witnessed. Television executives had always worried about what would happen if someone disrupted a live broadcast, especially with threats or violence. Dean Martin had just shown them that the best response to chaos wasn't panic, it was professionalism and unshakable cool. CBS executives, who were NBC's main competitors, immediately began studying footage of Dean's response to understand how they could train their own performers to handle similar situations. The incident became a case study in television production schools across the country. The NBC footage of Dean's response to the death threat became one of the most requested clips in television history. Crisis management trainers began using it as an example of how to diffuse tense situations. Public speaking coaches showed it to students as a masterclass in maintaining composure under pressure. Law enforcement agencies also took notice. The FBI began using Dean's response as a training example for hostage negotiators, showing how calm conversation could diffuse violent situations better than force or confrontation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in crisis intervention, wrote a landmark paper about Dean's technique. Martin demonstrated that when faced with aggression, the most powerful response isn't counter-aggression, it's empathy, humor, and the refusal to be drawn into the aggressor's emotional state. But perhaps the most important impact was on Dean Martin's own legend. The incident proved once and for all that his King of Cool persona wasn't just an act, it was who he really was when the pressure was at its highest. Frank Sinatra, who had watched the entire incident from backstage, later said it was the most impressive thing he had ever seen Dean do. "I've seen Dino handle hecklers. I've seen him deal with technical problems. I've seen him perform when he was sick," Frank told reporters. "But I've never seen anyone handle a death threat with that much class. That's when I knew Dean wasn't just cool, he was the coolest human being on the planet." The incident also changed how live television was produced. Networks realized that instead of fearing unexpected disruptions, they could trust professional entertainers to handle them with grace. The rigid, over-controlled approach to live TV began to loosen up, allowing for more spontaneous and authentic moments. Other entertainers began requesting that their own shows include more live elements, hoping to capture some of the magic that Dean had created through his spontaneous response to crisis. Years later, television historians would identify Dean's response to Vince Torino's death threat as one of the pivotal moments in broadcast entertainment history. Martin didn't just diffuse a dangerous situation, Robert Thompson wrote. He demonstrated that the best television happens when real human character is revealed under pressure. That 5-minute segment contained more genuine entertainment value than most scripted shows. The clip of Dean's response became one of the first viral videos of the pre-internet era, passed around on bootleg tapes and shown at parties as an example of the coolest thing anyone had ever seen on television. Comedians began referencing it in their acts, and other performers would jokingly ask their audiences if anyone wanted to make death threats before they started their shows.
But Dean himself was characteristically modest about the incident.
"Look," he told Johnny Carson during a Tonight Show appearance months later, "the guy was obviously having a bad day. I've had bad days, too. The only difference is that most people don't threaten to kill someone on live television during their bad days." Dean paused for the laugh, then continued. "Besides, I figured if I was going to get killed, at least 40 million people would see it happen. That's better ratings than most of my movies got." The death threat incident became a defining moment in Dean Martin's career, but not because it showed his fearlessness, because it showed his humanity. In a moment when he could have responded with anger, fear, or aggression, he chose kindness, humor, and understanding. Vince Torino never made another threat against anyone. He credited Dean Martin with teaching him a better way to handle his anger and frustration. He became a regular viewer of The Dean Martin Show and eventually started a support group for people dealing with anger management issues. The support group, which Vince called the Cool Response, used Dean's handling of the death threat as a template for managing conflict. The group grew from 5 members to over 200 within 2 years, and similar groups began forming in other cities. Dean showed me that you don't have to match someone else's energy. You can choose your own response regardless of what someone else brings to you. Dean Martin's response to a death threat on live television didn't just become the coolest moment in entertainment history. It became a lesson in how to handle life's most difficult moments with grace, humor, and unshakable humanity. When faced with hatred, Dean Martin responded with kindness. When faced with violence, he responded with humor. When faced with chaos, he responded with cool. That's not just entertainment, that's art. And that's why, more than 50 years later, Dean Martin's response to a death threat is still considered the coolest moment ever captured on television.